The Dalton Highway, a name that might sound harmless, but for those who've driven it, it's a journey fraught with peril. Stretching nearly 414 miles, 666 kilometers, through Alaska's frozen wilderness, this route cuts across icy forests, snow-capped mountains, and vast, desolate lands devoid of human presence. Known as the Highway to Hell, Dalton's danger lies not only in its treacherous slopes and slippery ice, but also in the eerie, mysterious tales that have haunted it for years. From unexplained disappearances to shadowy figures that appear and vanish in an instant, and whisperers in the dead of night that send chills down the spine, Dalton has earned its sinister reputation. For truck drivers, surviving Dalton is not just a physical feat, but a battle against an unseen fear lurking in the shadows. In 2017, another strange disappearance added to its grim lore. A seasoned trucker, Jack Morgan, vanished without a trace on a night of heavy snowfall. His truck was left behind, but Jack and the explanation for what happened were gone forever. This story, like many others on Dalton, has no clear conclusion, but it serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes what we cannot see is the most terrifying. On that fateful night, Jack Morgan stepped into Dalton's darkness and never returned. This is his story, a tale of one fateful night, a frozen highway, and a mystery that may never be unraveled. A December night on the Dalton Highway is no place for the faint-hearted. The wind howled relentlessly, like mournful wails rising from the icy earth below. Snow fell heavily, each large flake spiraling against the windshield, obscuring the view for anyone brave enough to navigate this treacherous road. Inside the cab of the massive truck, Jack Morgan sat behind the wheel, his eyes fixed on the blinding whiteness ahead. The crackling hum of an old radio played a soft country tune, blending with the steady growl of the engine. A small comfort in the endless solitude stretching across the hours. Jack was a seasoned driver. Over 20 years of trucking through every imaginable weather condition had forged his nerves of steel. But tonight, something felt off. He couldn't put it into words. Just an unshakable unease, like an invisible hand squeezing his mind. The snow was heavier than usual, and the Dalton looked like an unending ribbon of ice disappearing into the dark. On either side of the road stood barren trees, frozen in place like ghostly sentinels amidst the blizzard. The farther he drove, the colder the night seemed to grow, biting deeper than he'd ever felt before. The truck trudged forward, its headlights cutting through the snow but illuminating little ahead. Jack adjusted his side mirrors out of habit, but this time, the reflection unsettled him. There was nothing there, just darkness, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Something or someone was there, even if it couldn't be seen. He shrugged, chuckling nervously at himself. "Just tired," he muttered, reaching for the cold cup of coffee sitting on the dashboard. Time dragged on endlessly on this road. The clock on the dashboard read 1:47 a.m. Not a single other vehicle in sight, no signs of life anywhere. Just Jack, his truck, and the lonely expanse of the Dalton Highway stretching through the night. What Jack didn't know was that this fateful journey would never end as he planned. Something awaited him ahead, hidden within the snow and the unforgiving darkness. As Jack kept driving unaware, he was slowly crossing into a mystery that might never be unraveled. The truck's headlights sliced through the darkness, casting their beams onto the snow-covered road ahead. By now, Jack felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at him, his eyelids heavy after hours of tense driving. Suddenly, in the faint light ahead, he spotted a figure. At first, he thought his tired mind was playing tricks on him. But no. There it was, a shadowy form standing motionless in the middle of the road, less than 50 meters away. Jack's heart pounded. Who would be out here at this hour, in weather this brutal? The Dalton Highway was no place for pedestrians. The nearest towns were hundreds of kilometers apart, and no one could survive here without proper preparation. Jack instinctively eased off the accelerator, and slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the slick, icy road with a high-pitched screech. The truck came to a halt, its headlights illuminating the figure ahead. But what struck Jack as odd was the figure's complete stillness. It didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react at all to the blinding glare of the headlights. Squinting, Jack tried to get a better look. The person wore a dark, heavy coat. Their head bowed low, hair whipping wildly in the storm. Their arms hung limply at their sides with no bag or belongings, no signal for help, nothing. That struck Jack as strange. Normally, someone lost or in distress would wave or gesture frantically for assistance. But this figure stood there, utterly still, as if oblivious to the presence of the massive truck just meters away. A creeping unease settled over Jack. He grabbed a flashlight, zipped up his coat, and stepped out of the cab, his boots sinking into the thick snow. The frigid wind howled around him, its icy grip cutting through his layers. He directed the flashlight toward the figure and called out, "Hey, are you okay? What are you doing out here?" But there was no response. As the beam of his flashlight swept through the swirling snow, Jack froze. The figure was gone. In the mere seconds it had taken him to step out of the truck, the shadowy figure had vanished. A chill ran down Jack's spine, sharper than the biting wind. His grip on the flashlight tightened as he scanned the surroundings, his breath fogging in the icy air. The storm's howling wind was the only sound, and there were no signs of movement, no footprints leading away, no indication that anyone else had been there. Jack muttered under his breath, "I couldn't have imagined that. I saw someone." But no matter how hard he tried to spot the figure again, they had completely disappeared, as if swallowed by the night. Then, something caught his eye under the truck's headlights. A detail that sent a shiver through him. On the snow, right where the figure had been standing, were footprints. They were clear and deep, leading from the middle of the road toward the edge of the forest, disappearing into the dark, towering trees. Jack hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to get back in the truck and leave. But a mix of curiosity and an inexplicable pull drove him forward. He stepped cautiously, following the trail. The forest loomed ahead, its shadows seeming to stretch out toward him, eager to consume him. The air grew heavier, colder, and with each step, Jack felt the weight of an unseen presence. Deep down, he knew he had crossed into something far beyond his understanding. Jack stood frozen for a moment, his eyes locked onto the footprints etched into the snow. They were starkly visible under the truck's headlights, deep and deliberate, as if someone had just passed through moments ago. The trail led from the center of the road, where the figure had been standing, toward the edge of the forest. The wind howled louder, biting through his layers and chilling him to the bone, but Jack couldn't tear his eyes away. Part of him wanted to turn back to the truck, slam the door shut, and drive away as fast as he could. But another part, an aching, insistent curiosity, urged him to move closer. He flicked on his flashlight, its feeble beam tracing the path of the footprints. "This has to be real," he muttered under his breath, as if trying to convince himself. The footprints couldn't be imagined. They were too vivid, too precise, and they stretched too far for this to be a prank. Carefully, Jack followed the trail, each of his steps crunching against the thick snow. The frigid air pressed against his chest, making each breath laborious. Yet he pressed on, the flashlight's beam never leaving the footprints leading into the dark, ominous forest. The trail pulled Jack further away from the truck, into a realm where the glow of its headlights no longer reached. He began to notice the unnatural silence around him. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling branches, only the eerie, ceaseless wail of the wind, as if warning him to turn back. Still, Jack pushed forward, his flashlight trembling in his gloved hand as the cold gnawed at his fingers. Then, abruptly, he stopped. The footprints, which had been clear and consistent, suddenly vanished. They ended in the middle of an open patch of snow, leaving no sign of continuation. Jack swept the flashlight in every direction, searching for any clue. A snapped twig, a disturbed patch of snow, anything to explain where the person could have gone. But there was nothing. The footprints simply stopped, as if the person had evaporated into thin air. A lump formed in Jack's throat. He took a few hesitant steps forward, his mind racing with questions that had no answers. How could the trail just end? Where had the person gone? The wind seemed to grow fiercer, its shrieks interwoven with a faint, unfamiliar sound, a whisper, soft and indistinct, echoing from somewhere distant. Jack turned his gaze toward the forest, his eyes brimming with unease. The darkness between the trees seemed alive, like doorways into another realm, a place he had no desire to enter. For a fleeting moment, Jack thought he saw movement among the trees, a faint, shadowy blur with no discernible form. His heart pounded harder, the primal sense of being watched overwhelming him. He directed his flashlight toward the spot, but the beam revealed nothing but still, silent trees. A deep, unshakable fear gripped Jack. This was no longer curiosity. It was a visceral dread he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. Jack turned to head back to the truck. But when he looked toward it, his breath caught in his throat. The truck's headlights, which had previously stood out sharply against the snow, now seemed dimmer, as if the vehicle itself was being swallowed by the storm. The darkness around him felt heavier, pressing in like a living force, as though the very space was conspiring to trap him. The footprints had led him here, but now they left him with nothing but an all-encompassing emptiness. Panic surged through Jack as he began to run, his boots sinking into the snow with every stride, each step heavier than the last. Yet the more he ran, the farther away the truck seemed to grow. The wind howled with an almost human quality, its whispers and shrieks closing in around him, as if mocking his efforts to escape. Jack had the chilling sense that he had stumbled into another world, a place he could never leave, a place that would forever remain his prison. Jack rushed toward the truck, his breath visible in the freezing air as he gasped for oxygen. The snow crunched loudly under his boots, but every step felt heavier, as if an invisible force was dragging him deeper into an unshakable sense of dread. The truck's headlights ahead seemed to dim, their once reliable glow now shrouded by an inexplicable haze. Jack pointed his flashlight toward it, but the beam reflected only the snow, unable to penetrate the creeping darkness surrounding him. He stopped and tried to steady himself. "There's nothing there, just wind, just snow," he murmured, though even his own voice trembled. His hands shook, not just from the biting cold, but from the fear clawing its way into his mind. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, its beam stuttering unpredictably. Jack tapped it, trying to coax it back to life. This time, the light went out completely, plunging him into absolute darkness. Jack stood still, swallowed by the frigid night, the only sounds being the relentless howling wind and the pounding of his heart in his chest. Then, from within the wind, a new sound emerged. At first it was faint, a whisper so soft it could barely be distinguished from the storm. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was voices. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, speaking all at once. Their overlapping murmurs were incomprehensible, as though each voice spoke in a language Jack couldn't understand. Spinning around, Jack turned his gaze back toward the forest where he had followed the footprints. But instead of the path he had walked, he now saw something else. A shadowy figure loomed in the distance, massive and undefined, slowly making its way toward him. It didn't resemble a person. Its form was amorphous, a swirling mass of pure darkness, as if the night itself had coalesced into a physical entity. The closer it came, the colder and heavier the air around Jack seemed to grow. Panicking, Jack shouted, "Who's there? What do you want?" But there was no response. The shadow continued its approach, silent and implacable, offering no sign of life or intent. Frantically, Jack fumbled through his coat pockets, searching for anything he could use to defend himself. His fingers found only the small lighter he always carried. He stumbled backward, his legs quivering, unable to tear his gaze away from the encroaching darkness. The wind intensified, howling with such ferocity that it threatened to knock Jack off his feet. Then, amidst the cacophony, he heard it. A single voice, cutting through the overlapping whispers. It was deep, cold, and unrelenting, resonating with a clarity that froze the blood in his veins. "Don't look back," it said. Jack felt his body stiffen as though the words themselves had paralyzed him. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, he turned toward the truck, intent on running. But as he did, his heart sank. The truck was gone. The spot where it had been was now an empty void, blacker than the night around it, as though it had never been there at all. He spun in circles, his panic reaching a fever pitch. Snow fell in blinding sheets now, the wind screaming in his ears. The voices swirled around him, coming from every direction, their whispers intertwining into a suffocating symphony of chaos. Desperately, Jack screamed into the storm, his voice breaking. "What is happening? What do you want from me?" But there was no reply. Only darkness and the endless wind. In what Jack would later recognize as his final conscious moment, the shadow was upon him. Silent, all-encompassing, and utterly void of light, it engulfed him completely. There was no sound, no struggle, just an overwhelming stillness that followed in its wake. And then, there was nothing. The Dalton Highway returned to its eerie, frozen silence, as if Jack and everything that had happened had never existed. As the first light of dawn broke over the Dalton Highway, the road returned to its usual desolate and frigid state. Snow continued to fall, softer than the night before, blanketing everything in a pristine white layer. The first driver of the morning, making his way down the lonely stretch of road, noticed something unusual in the distance. A large truck was parked by the roadside, its engine silent, with no signs of anyone inside. The truck stood there, eerily still, like a forgotten relic. Snow lightly dusted the cab and wheels, but the vehicle showed no signs of damage or distress. It appeared perfectly intact. The driver pulled his own truck over and approached cautiously. He knocked on the cab's window, but there was no response. The cabin was empty. The keys were still in the ignition, but there was no trace of the driver. Jack Morgan had vanished without a clue. The authorities arrived not long after. They conducted an extensive search of the surrounding area, combing through the forest and the snow-covered landscape. The only footprints they found were near the truck, leading toward the tree line. But just as Jack had seen that night, the footprints abruptly ended. They didn't lead anywhere, offering no indication of where Jack might have gone. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. Inside Jack's truck, investigators found nothing out of the ordinary. The cargo was untouched, and there were no signs of a struggle or foul play. However, a flashlight was discovered a few meters from the truck, partially buried in the snow. Strangely, the flashlight was still on, its faint beam flickering weakly as though it had been left on all night. It was the only piece of evidence they uncovered. Jack Morgan was never found. No trace of him, no explanation for his disappearance. His truck was eventually towed away, but the incident quickly faded into obscurity, becoming just another unsolved mystery along the Dalton Highway. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the road's long-standing reputation for the supernatural. They claimed that the shadows in the night weren't human but lost spirits, forever trapped in Alaska's eternal cold, pulling anyone foolish enough to cross their boundaries into the void. Years later, truckers passing through that stretch of road would recount eerie tales of their own. Some spoke of hearing whispers carried by the wind, indistinguishable but unnervingly close. Others swore they saw a solitary figure standing in the middle of the road on snow-laden nights. Yet no one dared to stop. No one wanted to find out what lay beyond the veil of darkness. Jack Morgan's story became a chilling warning to anyone brave or unlucky enough to drive the Dalton Highway at night. Don't stop. Don't step outside. And if you see something, ignore it, because some answers are better left unknown. Jack stepped out of his truck that night, and he never came back. The mystery of his disappearance lingers, woven into the shadows that forever haunt the Dalton Highway. By daylight, the Dalton Highway looks like any other road. Pristine snow blankets the landscape, its icy surface reflecting the light in a cold, mesmerizing beauty. But when night falls, the road transforms into something else. A place no driver wants to linger, where shadows are more than just figments of the imagination. The disappearance of Jack Morgan in 2017 wasn't the first, nor would it be the last. Along this nearly 414-mile stretch of icy wilderness, strange and chilling stories have passed from one generation of truckers to the next. Some tell of shadowy figures standing motionless in the middle of the road during freezing winter nights. Others speak of whispers, soft, eerie voices heard when they stop along the roadside, sounds that don't belong to this world. Jack Morgan became another chapter in the Dalton's legend, a tale of mystery that inspires both fascination and fear. He left behind no trace, no note, no explanation that could bring closure. All that remains is a simple fact. On that fateful night, Jack stepped out of his truck and never returned. His truck still sits there, a silent witness to an enigma no one has been able to solve. Years later, as drivers pass the stretch of road where Jack disappeared, many claim to feel an unshakable presence. Some report glimpsing a faint light, like a flashlight beam flickering deep within the trees. Others describe the unsettling sensation of being watched from the shadows, though when they turn to look, they see nothing but darkness and the unyielding cold of the snow-covered forest. And you, if you're hearing this story, remember this. If you ever find yourself driving the Dalton Highway at night, don't stop. Don't step outside. And if you see a figure standing in the road, keep driving. Sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you see, it's what you can't see. Jack Morgan stopped, and he never escaped the shadows of the Dalton Highway. The shadows are still there, waiting for the next traveler to pause on the highway to hell.